Most people only saw the smile, the charm, the wit, the red carpets and the sharp suits. The way he'd light up a room with a joke or disarm an interviewer with nothing but a raised eyebrow and that signature smirk. To the world, Robert Downey Jr. was unbreakable, but no one ever really asked what it took to keep that smile alive. Because behind the applause, behind the billion-dollar box office and the Iron Man mask, there was a silence that echoed loudest when the lights went out, when the cameras stopped. When the fans were gone, there was a pain Robert never talked about, a weight he carried like a shadow that never left his side. And for years he let the world believe the performance, because that's what survivors do. He wasn't born into pain, but he inherited it, born into a home where creativity and chaos lived side by side. Robert's earliest memories weren't filled with lullabies. They were filled with smoke, loud voices, and a constant search for something that couldn't be named. His father, Robert Downey Sr., was a filmmaker, brilliant, eccentric, loving in his own broken way, but he was also a man caught in his own darkness. And in the haze of that household, Robert Jr. learned one thing very early. To be noticed, you had to shine. So he became light, funny, smart, unstoppable. But what no one saw was that his brightness was fueled by fear. Fear of being overlooked. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of not being enough when the applause stopped. And so began the pattern. The higher he flew, the harder he crashed. The more he made people laugh, the less they noticed his tears. Because no one ever thinks the clown is crying. By the time he was a teenager, Robert had already become two people. One that the world could love, charming, magnetic, easy to root for. And one the mirror only saw when it was quiet, confused, heavy, scared. It was around that age when his father handed him his first joint. Not out of malice, not out of neglect, but out of habit. That was just the world Robert was raised in, a world where drugs weren't hidden in shame. They floated in the air like cigarette smoke, passed between adults like jokes, treated more like a spice than a poison. He didn't even think twice when he took it. It felt like breathing, like finally sinking into something that made the noise in his head quiet down. The fear, the self-doubt, the ache to be more. What started as a small escape quickly turned into a full-time residency in a prison of his own design. And the most dangerous part? He was still smiling, still booking jobs, still nailing lines, still being the Robert everyone wanted to see. Because pain, when it's dressed in charisma, becomes invisible. Even the rise was spectacular. Critics called him a genius. Directors called him electric. Fans called him the next great American actor. And inside, Robert was slowly dying. Not always physically, but spiritually, emotionally. He would shoot all day and spiral all night. He wasn't partying. He was escaping. And deep down, even he knew. He wasn't trying to feel good. He was trying to feel nothing. Because nothing was better than the weight of everything. And still no one really saw it. Why would they? He was brilliant, until the cracks became earthquakes. There was the time he was arrested driving naked in his Porsche, high out of his mind, muttering that he was being chased. The time he wandered into a neighbor's house and fell asleep in their bed. The mugshots, the courtrooms, the rehab stints that blurred together like a carousel he couldn't get off of. And still, even then, people called him a troubled star or a wasted talent. But few called him what he really was, a man in pain, because people don't know how to hold space for that. It's easier to mock than to understand. Easier to say he had it all, than to ask why he couldn't feel any of it. And through all of it, Robert kept quiet, because that's what men were taught, that to admit you're hurting is to admit you're weak. That crying means broken. That asking for help means failure. So he suffered silently, until silence nearly killed him. The truth is, Robert Downey Jr. didn't survive because he was strong. He survived because he broke. Because rock bottom was the only place left to stand, when the world around him had crumbled, and the one inside him had long collapsed. There was a night, just another in a blur of nights, where he sat alone in a jail cell. No cameras, no entourage, no audience to charm. Just a cold metal bench, a flickering light, and the sound of his own breathing. It was the first time he didn't want to be Robert Downey Jr. He didn't want to be anything. The weight of disappointment in himself, in who he had become, in the people he had hurt, was heavier than any sentence a judge could hand him. He had failed every person who believed in him. his family, his fans, but more painfully, himself. And in that stillness, stripped of everything, fame, status, freedom, something unexpected happened. He heard himself, not the version he performed, not the voice he used in interviews, but the child he had buried under years of addiction, fame, and fear. The boy who just wanted to be loved, not for what he could do, but for who he was. Even that night didn't change everything. Nothing that real changes overnight. But it planted something. Not hope, not yet. Just the possibility of it. When he got out, the world wasn't waiting with flowers. It was waiting with doubt. Studios didn't want to hire him. Insurance companies wouldn't back him. The industry had written his obituary, even if the papers hadn't. But he fought. Not loudly, not dramatically. He fought the hardest battle a man can fight. The one against himself. Rehab, therapy, silence, relapses, more rehab. He apologized. Not just with words, but with time. With consistency. With effort. He rebuilt his life not with performances, but with presence. He didn't need a comeback. He needed redemption. And when the role of Tony Stark came around, he wasn't anyone's first choice. Some thought it was a joke. Casting a recovering addict as a billionaire genius. But Robert understood Tony in a way no one else could. Because both of them wore armor to hide their fear. Both of them masked pain with arrogance. Both of them had lost everything. And still dared to build something new. It wasn't acting. It was a mirror. And when he said, "I am Iron Man," it wasn't a line. It was a declaration. Not of power, but of survival. The success of Iron Man changed everything. But not in the way most people think. Yes, the box office exploded. Yes, he became the face of a new era of superhero cinema. But none of that mattered as much as what was happening off-screen. Because behind every press tour and premiere, Robert was still waking up every day with the same quiet question. Can I hold this together? Recovery doesn't end with applause. Fame doesn't erase trauma. And every time the world celebrated Iron Man, Robert had to remind himself that he was still human. Fragile, flawed, fighting quietly every day to stay balanced. Because pain doesn't disappear when the spotlight comes on. It hides, it waits, and it whispers when the noise dies down. Robert knew this, so he made a choice to stop hiding from it. He began opening up slowly at first, not in dramatic interviews, not in best-selling memoirs, but in conversations with people who actually needed to hear it. Young actors, addicts in recovery, veterans battling PTSD. He didn't speak as a celebrity. He spoke as a man who had been shattered, and who chose, again and again, to piece himself back, together without knowing if anyone would care once he did. And the most beautiful thing, people listened, because when Robert Downey Jr. said, "You are not your lowest moment," they believed him. Because he wasn't preaching from a pedestal, he was walking beside them, with scars he didn't try to hide. He married again, this time to someone who didn't try to save him. Susan didn't fall in love with Iron Man, she fell in love with the man who was trying not to be a hero anymore, just a father, a husband, a human being. She stood by him. She helped him heal, not by fixing him, but by reminding him that he was worth fixing. And slowly the pain became something else, not a burden, but a bridge. A way to connect, to teach, to comfort, became part of the why. Why he showed up, why he told the truth, why he stayed alive. He didn't become a preacher. He didn't claim to have answers. What Robert Downey Jr. did instead was show up in places most stars avoid. In rehab centers with peeling walls and flickering lights. In youth shelters where teens clung to silence like armor. In community theaters and classrooms where hope flickered in fragile hearts. He didn't wear suits. He didn't sign autographs. He sat down. He listened. He let them talk. And when they were done, he'd say something simple. I've been there. Because he had. He had looked in the mirror and hated what he saw. He had begged for one more chance long after he'd used the last one. He had curled up on the floor, praying to disappear. And he had survived it. That survival became his greatest role. Not Iron Man, not Sherlock Holmes, but the man who made recovery something sacred, something masculine, something possible. There's a reason Robert rarely spoke about his darkest days in detail. Not because he was ashamed, but because he respected them. He knew there were still people living in that place, trapped in addiction, drowning in pain, crushed under the weight of expectation. He didn't want his story to be a trophy. He wanted it to be a tool, a key to unlock the cages others thought they'd never leave. So he gave it away, quietly, humbly, not on late-night shows, but in hospital rooms, at midnight phone calls, through handwritten letters. He once said in a small group circle, "You don't owe the world your trauma, but if you're willing to share it, you might just save someone else." Even when the world saw him as redeemed, even when Marvel crowned him a king, the pain never fully left. It lived quietly, under the surface, like a scar, no longer bleeding but still there. Some days were light, some days were heavy, and some days he had to remind himself, moment by moment, that he was not the man he used to be. That's the part most people never see. The maintenance, the mindfulness, the daily commitment to stay upright when the floor still trembles beneath you. But Robert didn't resent it. He honored it. Because pain, when owned, can become the strongest kind of power. With every passing year, Robert Downey Jr. didn't just age, he evolved. The sparkle in his eyes remained. The charm never left. But there was a new depth behind it all now. It wasn't the kind you learn in acting school. It was the kind you earn through loss, through healing, through facing yourself in moments where no one's watching. And perhaps the most beautiful part of Robert's story isn't just that he came back, but that he came back different. Not performing pain, but carrying wisdom. Not hiding behind characters, but standing fully in his own skin. The Hollywood machine wanted a blockbuster hero, but what they got was a man who had been shattered and still chose to build others. And that choice echoed further than any Marvel movie ever could. Even in quiet moments, he began investing in things no one expected. Rehabilitation programs for the incarcerated, therapy access in underserved schools, environmental sustainability initiatives that didn't make the headlines. He didn't need credit, he just needed impact, because Robert had seen how easy it was to lose your name, to become just a punchline or a file number or a whisper in someone else's gossip. So he used his voice not to shout over people, but to lift those who couldn't be heard at all. A teenager in crisis, a veteran battling nightmares, a mother afraid her son wouldn't live to see 30. He looked them in the eye, and without fanfare he'd say, "You're not broken. You're becoming." That became his mission, to remind the world that survival is not shameful, that being lost doesn't mean you're weak, that the road back home, no matter how long, is worth walking. He didn't glamorize his past. He told it with honesty, not for applause, but for the one person somewhere, sitting in their own silent prison, thinking they were alone. Because Robert had been that person. And if someone had reached for him sooner, if someone had said your pain doesn't define your worth, maybe the journey wouldn't have been so long. So now he became that someone. Robert Downey Jr. never declared himself healed. He never stood on a podium to say, "I've made it." Because healing, he knew, wasn't a destination. It was a rhythm, a decision you keep making quietly, on the days when your hands still shake and your memories still sting. The pain never fully left, but it changed shape. It became something he could hold, like a scar across his chest. Not ugly, not shameful, just part of the story. And eventually, that pain gave him something he never had before. Peace, not the kind you find on red carpets or magazine covers, but the kind that whispers at night when the world is asleep and you finally believe you deserve rest. He no longer needed to prove anything, not to the critics, not to the fans, not even to himself. He just needed to live. Fully, honestly, quietly. In his later years, Robert began to step back. From blockbusters, from the spotlight, not because he was done, but because he had arrived. He spent more time at home, in the garden, with his children, with Susan, the woman who had seen every version of him and still chose to stay. He adopted animals. He read books on energy and philosophy. He invested in sustainability. He showed up for people. Not with speeches, but with presence. No mask, no armor, no need to be Iron Man, because for once being Robert was enough. There's a moment that those closest to him remember vividly. A child at a charity event, no older than 7, walked up to him shyly. She wasn't wearing a superhero shirt. She wasn't holding an autograph book. She was just holding a small crumpled note. She handed it to him. He unfolded it slowly. It read, "Thank you for making my dad believe he can get better." Robert didn't cry in front of cameras, But he held that note for a long time, because in that tiny slip of paper lived every reason he ever needed for all the battles, all the rebuilding, all the pain he had endured. He had survived for this, not for fame, but to be a reason someone else didn't give up. Years later, someone asked him in a quiet interview, "What do you think is the most important role you've ever played?" He smiled, gently, not performatively, then said, "The one no one saw. Not Tony Stark, not Sherlock, but the man who helped others find the courage to face their own darkness. The man who told the truth, who hurt, who healed, who helped. The man who showed the world that pain doesn't make you less of a man. It makes you real." Robert Downey Jr.'s story isn't one of perfection. It's one of redemption, resilience, rebirth. He taught us that the strongest people aren't the ones who never fall, but the ones who rise again, carry their pain with grace, and use it to light the way for others still in the dark. So the next time you see him on screen, smiling, laughing, saving the world, just remember, the real hero wasn't in the suit. He was the man who took it off, looked in the mirror, and finally said, "I am enough."